Look at what I have here, traveller. A Yasuke comic. Fresh off the minstrel's press. Absolutely dazzling drawings, incredibly epic fight scenes. Entertaining? Absolutely so. But true? Well, not quite. Which begs the question, why do we keep messing with the details of stories that have not yet been told but are so substantial on their own? You see, the real Yasuke, he served Oda Nobunaga, the devil. He fought in the infamous Honoji incident. And he left a mark on history that was significant enough that we are still talking about his story today. But through anime and video games and Hollywood, they tend to shift the story. They pile on mystical twists and skip half of the facts. So allow me, if you will, to unravel the absolutely incredible true story, the things that we know, from that which is pure fiction. And we'll explain why a story so bold keeps getting rewritten over and over again. Picture for me, if you will, the Sengoku period in Japan. A time of endless wars, all vying to unify Japan. And enter Oda Nobunaga. The devil. Ambitious, ruthless, forging ties with Jesuits and Portuguese traders, introducing firearms and rattling the feudal norms. He nearly united the land, until betrayal ended his dream. And that is the stage where Yasuke steps in. An African man standing in Nobunaga's court, turning heads in a society that was not accustomed to such distant foreigners. He arrived in Japan around 1579 with Jesuit missionaries, and by 1581, he had caught the attention of Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga fancied himself somewhat of a collector of curiosities, of strange artifacts and strange individuals. So this tall and substantial foreigner most certainly caught his eye. So here's what we know for sure. Yasuke appeared in Japan around 1579 with the Jesuit missionary from Italy, Alessandro Villano. He first met Oda Nobunaga in 1581, and Nobunaga was so fascinated by him that he took him to be scrubbed to ensure that his skin was actually that color and not just dirty. Scrubbed him for several hours just to be sure. And then what we know later is that he was brought into the service of Oda Nobunaga as a weapons bearer to carry his weapons when traveling and possibly during wartime, and that later he would be granted a weapon, a stipend, meaning he was paid by the estate of Nobunaga, and he would be granted a private residence. And amongst all of this, at some point, he was also granted the name Yasuke by Nobunaga. These details come from Otogi-uchi's Chronicle of Lord Nobunaga and some Jesuit letters that reference the African retainer. And each of them reaffirms for us that he was a bit more than a curiosity for Nobunaga. Now, was Yasuke a samurai? Well, this is the most debated aspect of his character, and because of questionable academics who have based their entire career off of being correct about this, there is a lot out there that suggests that he was most definitely, but what we have in primary sources doesn't actually tell us that that was ever the case. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. And part of the reason it is so heavily debated is because the term samurai was not as rigidly used in the Sengoku period as it would be later on. Nobunaga gave him a sword. That implies that he at least had warrior status. Yet, skeptics note that he was neither born into that class, as you would have to be later on, and he was not forced to commit seppuku with all of the other retainers of Oda Nobunaga after the fact, which suggested that he had not gained the status of samurai by then. But we do know that from all accounts he was not just a regular retainer or a novelty to Nobunaga. He had earned Nobunaga's trust, he took part in key strategic meetings, and he had privileges that far surpassed menial servitude. So he may not have strictly been a samurai in the Edo definition of it, but he was at the very least recognized as a warrior in Nobunaga's sphere. And here in 1582, Akechi Mitsuhide betrayed Nobunaga at what would later be called the Honoji incident. And Yasuke was there during this incident, a small retinue facing overwhelming forces. Sources say that he fought at Nobunaga's side, though we don't have a lot of details as to what exactly happened, and there are even some secondary sources that claim he fought to keep Nobunaga's remains, his head specifically, so that it would not be flaunted by his enemies. And that is deeply significant in warrior and samurai culture in Japan of the time. The fortress fell, and Yasuke's loyalty in those final moments cement his heroic deeds. And he would later be captured by Akechi, defending Nobunaga's heir, his son. And Akechi would spare him, saying that he was a foreigner, an animal not worth being killed. And it is said that Yasuke then returned to the Jesuits. And that's where his story ends. We have nothing else after that point, leaving us with an incredible mystery. What happened to him afterwards? No one truly knows. And that's the real question, isn't it? Yasuke's story alone is extraordinary. Traveling from African lands, befriending a feudal lord and gaining his trust. And not just his trust, but his respect. Fighting in a defining betrayal. Yet anime like Netflix Yasuke and mechs and magic and demonic warlords, which are all well and good. I love myself a good sense of fantasy. But we have yet to see a good retelling of his actual story. Video games always put him in a fantasy alliance, and Hollywood ponders scripts that hint at conspiracies that are never mentioned in the primary sources. There's this hunger to make him unstoppable, a mythical champion, yet ironically, it erases the actual tension of an African retainer in a foreign land, navigating a foreign culture and befriending and gaining the respect of one of the most legendary warlords in Japan's history, one who almost unified the entire country. The truth of the story is strong enough if we just let it stand. And there is this notion that Yasuke somehow changed the entire course of Japanese history. And I find that notion to be somewhat fantastical. Because Yasuke was not the only foreigner who found his way into the daimyos of Japan. No, there were several other notable figures that found their ways into Japanese service. Notable of which, there's a whole video game series that's roughly based on his life called Neo, about the man William Adams, also referred to as Miura Yanjin. He would come into Japan decades later, and he was an English pilot in the service of Tokugawa Ieyasu. And he is referred to as a samurai. He received titles, land, and he ended up marrying a Japanese woman and living out the remainder of his life in Japan in the service of Ieyasu. And others of Portuguese and Spanish descent found themselves in the service working as military advisors or navigators for the daimyos in Japan. And as impressive as all of these men were, no single one of them changed the course of Japanese history. They left flickers of cross-cultural exchange, of course, but the country's trajectory was always shaped by its own internal powers and heroes. And that is the crucial point. No single foreigner ever changed the direction of Japanese history, none of them dramatically altering its fate. And in truth, men like Yasuke and Adams, they did bring fresh perspectives into the country. But Japan's deeper tides of change came from within, through warlords like Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and later Ieyasu. And don't get me wrong, Yasuke's presence was remarkable. The story alone suggests he was a remarkable man, but not the seismic shift that some tales suggest. So, traveler, Yasuke was indeed an African warrior who stood near the helm of one of the greatest daimyos in all of Japanese history. It was absolutely unheard of, absolutely. But he was not the unstoppable hero that pop culture makes him out to be. His actual feats, they were far from dull though. And this is what baffles me in the need to write them to be grander than they were. He defied cultural norms, earned one of the greatest warlords in Japanese history's trust, and faced the cataclysmic fall of Honoji. He had the respect of an era that was drenched in suspicion of outsiders. And other Europeans and foreigners too came in and gained titles and respect. But they rarely ever overshadowed the grander tapestry of Japan's history, with all of their warring clans and shifting alliances. Still, each foreign retainer's story offers a glimpse into cross-cultural contact in a fiercely insular time in Japan's history. So, the next time that you see Yasuke battling mechs and mystical creatures in faraway realms, remember that there is a true story beneath all of that fantasy. Stay bloodthirsty, my friends. Stay hungry for the truth that swirls around in all these many legends. And keep your eye on the horizon for the next yarn they'll try to reshape. See you next time, friends.